Hello and welcome to Nerdarchy. For nerds by nerds. I'm Nerdarchy Steve. Today I'm hanging out with this nerd. I'm doing well. Tonight we're talking about for beginners, right? And we have a couple of different ways we can look at that, right? We've got beginners as in beginner players, beginner DMs, but also like just starting out as adventurers, you're a beginner as well. So first of all, in the chat, and I'll bring this up again as we get more people in here as well. Feel free. They're saying something about muted. Oh, you're probably muted. Ted. You absolutely are muted. If you want to introduce yourself again,
I am Nerdarchy Ted. How are you doing this fine and lovely evening, sir?
it's all right, man. I unmuted the important people. I kid. I kid. So
It's like, all right, Dave is carrying this evening. I just gonna go over here.
yeah, Ted should have audio now, folks. But I would just say real important too is like if you guys have any questions that you want to ask for beginners or about being a beginner, whether it is a player or as a GM, feel free to ask. And again, I'm going to ask later on because I also feel like sometimes that for us, this is actually one of the hardest things is because we're so far removed from being beginners is like trying to remember what is like and also like to be honest with you guys, like the whole gaming sphere, the whole terrain that is gaming now is so much different than when we were growing up and we were learning the game first.
Indeed, I mean, just the sheer existence of the internet changes all of that. Just the complete ability to reach out and find other gamers, find information, find what the hell all of this is, find experienced people. Like, that didn't exist when we got started.
Yeah, I feel like back in the day, the way you got started playing D&D and other RPGs was like an older kid in the neighborhood showed up, or maybe an older sibling would round up other neighborhood kids and be like, "I have this thing that I want to try with you guys," right? And oftentimes, because D&D was never really the cool thing, they would actually have to generally go to the younger crowd because to make it seem cooler, and also the younger crowd was more likely to look up to them.
Yep.
So so that's kind of like how I got into it, right? My very first exposure to um, the basic red box was my neighbor came over to my house with it, and he was like 2 years older than me. Ian Wilson, I still remember, and we never actually even played that game. We played a couple games of Gamma Worlds with other kids that were like his age and even older, and then like I wouldn't touch any RPGs for probably like 4 or 5 years until like another older kid in the neighborhood where we would play like backyard sports and stuff. And sometimes this kid would play with us, and like one day after playing wiffle ball or run the bases or something, he's like, "Hey, you guys want to check out this thing?" And he pulled out his AD&D books. And that summer, all we did was play different role playing games and D&D. What was your experience like? For how did you get into? What was your kind of
So
initiation?
I don't know if it was directly through scouts or indirectly through scouts. I can remember, playing with some older kids and, an older scout's brother. Um, but I don't know if that was my first, foray into it. I know I got started around 12, 13 years old. I played a lot with scouts, and then eventually with, some of you know, the scouts outside of, meetings and camping trips and what have you. Um, my first serious campaign was, with Nate the Nerdarch, if you guys, out there remember from way back when, and then a handful of other kids that were in my scout troop. Um, but I mean, before that, like, everything was all you know, wishy washy, one shot kind of things. Nothing that was a serious campaign that ever was really going anywhere. I played a handful of RPGs over at this kid Vince's house, and I'd ride my bike literally through the woods at the end of the opposite neighborhood to get to his place after school, and we played. Um, we played a couple of games of Star Wars. We played some Shadowrun. Um, I remember my Elven Street Samurai that I played, and then of course we played a handful of games of D&D. I couldn't tell you anything about any of those campaigns. I got a
Yeah.
couple splotches of character concepts. Like I know I played a Wemmick Ranger out of the Humanoid's Handbook, and complete head fashion of you know loving fighting with two weapons. He was a ranger that fought with two swords. It was the standard deal for Ted's characters back then. But it was one of those things that's what I did.
So I want to say like a lot like there's some lessons that we can look at from when we were beginners and they still carry forward, but actually they're a lot more accessible and easier to use now. So one like the core concept in both of our kind of like origin story is more experienced players bringing us into the hobby
Mm-hmm.
and kind of showing us the ropes for better or worse. Um, and that still works. That's still a thing, right? Like you can still you can still do that, but now with the internet, you can go watch Matt Mercer, Critical Role run games, or any number of streamers that are out there run games and see how they do it. But also like you know back when we were kids, like you didn't have as many options. It was like there might only be one D&D group in town, and if you're lucky enough to get in on that, and you were just going to see how they play, and that's how you were going to learn that the game is played. But if you watch umpteen different streams, you might see umpteen different ways to play the game, which is good because now you can kind of tailor and pick the one that kind of speaks to you and what works for you. So so learning from a mentor or someone more experienced with you, you still have that, but now you have it in with a lot of choice as opposed to before where you're lucky if you had more than one person to kind of show you the ropes. So that part of it I feel like still kind of exists.
Yes.
Now, one of the things that we used to do with our beginners, our new players, is we kind of had like a buddy system, and we would like sit new players down next to a more experienced player that didn't mind helping, which was always useful. I feel like that's always a good way to do it as well. Back in the day, you'd get the books, read the books, and try to learn the rules that way. I still think that's good advice, but I also understand it doesn't work for everyone. And I've played lots of role playing games and learned lots of role playing games at this point without ever actually reading the books. So I wouldn't say it's a must and you absolutely have to do it, but it is useful. And also, oftentimes, on online discourse, people will be like, "I wish X was in D&D," but if you like actually go back and read the books, X is already
It is.
there. Whether it's an actual rule or maybe it's something in the DMG as optional rules. So I'll say too, like most RPG books, D&D included, aren't very exciting to read, right? Like especially some of the stuff can be, but after you kind of have more comprehension, but in the very beginning when you first open it up, it's all kind of like gobbledygook, right? Until you
Right.
kind of get a basic grasp of the game. So again, I'll say if you have questions, feel free to ask, especially if you happen to be new. Now I know like we've given out tons of advice when it comes to GMing, and I've seen some of that advice kind of refuted. And by no means were we the first ones to give that advice, but oftentimes online GMs will talk about not over preparing and kind of doing very improv style GMing. And I seen like another like newer GM kind of rail against that. um, and kind of call it bad advice. And I guess by itself, it might be construed as that. It's not so much that you shouldn't work on anything, right? Like we became huge fans of Sly Flourish and the Lazy GM or the Lazy DM and his series, which isn't really about not working or prepping material. It's about like what kinds of things are more useful and what kind of things are going to be helpful uh, for you as a GM. You know, like sometimes just writing out an adventure the way you might see a pre-published adventure isn't as useful because what we've learned from GMing is for many years is that a lot of times your players are going to do other stuff and they're just going to ignore all that material. But like if you then instead focus on the areas where they're going to be adventuring and exploring, you know, that might be time better spent. You know, you can always, like Sly Flourish has always talked about using not necessarily pre-planned adventures, but pre-planned encounters in the sense that taking a professionally designed encounter and ripping it out of other material, you know, source material, and just plopping it into your game. You know, it's already been vetted, it's already been designed and play tested by a professional, and it kind of like saves you some of the work. So you can probably spend more time working on more sandboxing things that might happen in the areas like where your players are going to be. Like inevitably, if they go to a new town, they always want to go shopping. So you're going to want to supply some shops. They're going to go to taverns and inns. You might want to have a list of those. And you know, at this point, even that stuff you can kind of buy prepackaged where you don't really have to make it up, but maybe you pick one or two that you like so that you can throw it out there when you need it.
But it's also a concept of, especially if you know the DM seat is rotating and you're coming to the table and you know the players and you know how their style of play, then you can prep the things that you know that they're going to be specifically interested in doing. Like I know there's a player that I've gamed with for a long time that he loves combat. So like while we tend to have combat light games, like I understand that very rarely am I going to have a session where there's no combat because, well, this player, it's a stress relief aspect when they get to kill shit, as they say.
Yeah.
And there's no problem with that concept. There's no issue with saying, well, all right, Joe likes this and Bob likes that, so I'm going to make sure that those things are options. And well, you know what? Tonight they decide they're not going to fight; they're going to talk their way through it. Well, cool, kudos. They decided to role play instead. Let's see how this goes. But it's always going to be a scenario as the GM, regardless of how much you plan. You don't know what's going to happen. No plan survives first contact. So yes, it is a struggle at times to take that DM seat for the first time. But once you do, and once you get over, that fear, that anxiety of, well, what if I do this wrong? What if I do, this instead of doing that? It's all right. You are taking the seat of power, and there is a lot of joy in being able to plot and plan a world, to enter into creativity and build a story that collectively you all get to share. Because the DM is a player at the table. They're not a player character, but you get to be the world. You get to unfold stories and reward and punish players, and I use that term loosely because I don't agree in punishing the players, but you get to have the villains act, and they can kind of punish characters for fouling up their plans. It's kind of the direction I was going. But when you get to be this puppet master and have all this fun, like I've said time and time again, I couldn't ever decide for the rest of my life. I'm only either a player or a GM. Couldn't do it. I love both sides. So having those options that are out there, if you want to explore that creativity, I highly recommend giving it a shot, and just push all the naughty voices aside and give it a go.
All right, so I'm gonna jump into the chat here.
Go for it.
Let's see. Nelson Spratt, you're up first. How do you rally new players to the game around the quest so that the story can progress?
How do you get players interested in the quests?
Yeah,
Dave.
how do you rally new players to the game around the quest so the story can progress?
All right. So I feel your methodology, works best, and it's a two-prong attack. Number one, a solid session zero that gives an overarching concept of what the game is. So you're approaching with a concept of a theme, uh, and then once you start playing, you're just going to drop quest lines until they bite on something. Whatever they decide to bite on, that's going to be your main story. You might not get it in the first session, you might not get to it till the third session, but you don't have to know all the ins and the outs when you first start. While yes, some DMs will say like, no, you have to have all of this plan, you need to know every single character in the world. To me, that's exhausting. Not going to happen for me ever. Like, there's still lots of holes in some of the games that I've played and finished that it's like, all right, well, they never decided to go down this arc, so I never wrote it. Oh well.
So
But go ahead.
I would say there's a third prong to to the attack.
Go for
One
it.
is having a solid session zero, like you said, and defining what the game's going to be about. Even if you're running a pre-written adventure like Curse of Strahd or any of them, what is it, Witchlight Beyond the or
Wild Beyond the Witchlight.
Wild Beyond the Witchlight, have the premise, have the player understand the premise, and make sure it's one they're interested in, and you are interested as the GM in doing. So both those things have to align. So this way, they come with the appropriate character, right? Like if you're gonna run, a nautical campaign, and they want to make a desert nomad, that's not gonna work. So either they're being obstinate or they're lacking pertinent information before the game started, right? So you have to make sure you line up there first. Second, Ted's right. I do like to drop a lot of plot threads, but the third thing that I do is I try to tie those plot threads to things that the player characters care about and are interested in. And hopefully, I found this out in session zero, or early on in the sessions through play, and then I just listen to the players, and when they're talking character and about things that they want to do, and that's the stuff I try and get them to do, and it's a lot less work than coming up with a huge overarching plot or quest or story, and then trying to figure out how to get them to bite on the hooks. Let them bait the hooks for you, and it becomes so much easier. Make the quest be something they care about. Here's one of the things you have to understand too. Like as a GM, more than likely you're gonna be like, "Oh, I got this cool idea. What do you guys think?" If they're your friends, they're probably not gonna be like, "Oh, your idea sucks," right? Like they'll be like, "Yeah," like they might be genuinely interested. They might feign interest. They might be somewhat interested, right? So that's one of the reasons why when we start a new game, I usually give my players options. I'll give them like 3 or 4 options, maybe 5 options, have them vote, and then whatever gets the most votes, that's what we're going to do. And I feel like you get more buy-in
It's another scenario that if you have players that are willing and able to write backstories and character goals, those things then become, oh, well, if I put this out there, then I know that at least this player is going to want to bite on that particular quest line, and I'll try and bring the others along. And I've brought this up before. My son's character, he wants to find the Sword of Vandus. I don't even know if this was a thing that he created or if I had said something about, and then he'd be like, oh yeah, I want to find that. But from session 0 on, like he's got that in his head that his character knows it, has heard of it, and he wants to find it. So I'm like, all right, well, all I need to do is drop in some kind of subtle hints about, what this is or where it could be, and that character at least is on board. Uh, so I wrote in your campaign a character that I honestly had no concept that you were going to do anything with. I wrote the origin story of how my character was a mutant. Because we have the elemental mutation sorcerer. So I'm like, all right, well, my character is going to be a simic hybrid mutant character in this post-apocalyptic world. This will be great. And I made up this character. He was my mentor. All kinds of messed me up, and then fled the city. And all of a sudden, like, he comes back in, and Dave had no idea how my character was going to act. Well, maybe I'm jumping the gun here. I think the conversation was like he thought that I would have just straight up attacked him right away. Where conceptually, this dude was powerful, so I'm like, nope, hands off. So that wound up changing, what that story arc was, because I was afraid to engage that character in combat right off the bat because I thought he was too powerful. Like, I'm like, dude, this guy's going to kick my ass. So this has now been, this ongoing story arc with this looming threat out there, all because I chose not to attack. So the whispered conversations have gone.
Yeah, I would say the other thing too is if you've got an online going quest and the players aren't really in a hurry to progress that storyline, like you need to kind of examine and think about why do they not want to progress that storyline, right? Is it that they don't understand how important it is? Is it that they don't understand that there's a maybe a time component, or do they just not care about that particular quest, right? Like other things are distracting them from it. Now, you can kind of get them back on track. And again, like I would go with, are there ways to make this quest personal to the players? If it already is personal and they still don't seem to care, then it's not a big enough draw, unfortunately. And there, there's nothing wrong with dropping a storyline that doesn't seem to be appealing to your players, right? Don't feel like you have to complete everything that happens. Also, you can let bad stuff happen in your world. It doesn't necessarily have to happen to the players, but like if the quest goes unfulfilled and there's bad things that are going to happen because of it, just let them happen and then see what they want to do with that. Maybe they don't want to do anything with it. Maybe they're like, we'll just move to the next kingdom. We really don't feel that compelled to stay here. So there's definitely things you can do to kind of like bring it back, figure out, and also you can always just ask your friends, be like, hey, are you guys not feeling this quest, or you don't feel like it's important to do right now, or do you feel like your characters aren't ready? Like sometimes it's just better to like ask them instead of just guessing.
That is true.
Let's see, Matthew. I'm presently playing in a 6-player party. The DM and I are the only two at the table that have ever played Dungeons and Dragons. The other 5 players are new to the game. That sounds like a blast to me. Also, later on, watching new players make bad decisions is far more entertaining than anything I could ever ask for. Yes, and you know what? There's also like an innocence to new players as well. Like they don't know the mechanics and they don't know all the rules, so they don't know what they can and can't do. And sometimes that is way more fun than having experienced players that maybe they move the game along faster, but not always in the most interesting ways. And then, you know, those new players might come up with ideas that players that have been playing the game for a long time haven't thought of because they're kind of like mired in looking at their character sheet and what abilities they have. So, one of the nice things about new players is it can kind of be refreshing at the table to not be burdened with all the rules and all the baggage that is D&D.
And with that side, without knowing the rules, they come up with some amazing ideas. They can be quite imaginative. They're also going to bring fresh perspective. They're going to bring, a new life to the table and to the game. And then you, as the DM or a fellow players, you can kind of get to see the joy and the horror as they get exposure to, the game world. They get to find like the regeneration of trolls for the first time can be utterly a terrifying thing. And this foe finally went down and then it decides to get back up after you thought it was already dead. It's like, no, like you don't get to do that very often. And to see that realization happen is something that, you know, it's a once a person thing. Like, so it's tough.
Yeah, so I think from the DM's perspective, when you're dealing with new players, like I would encourage that behavior. I mean, oftentimes I'll tell players to not so much worry about their character sheets. Just tell me what you want to do, and then we'll figure it out from there. Right? And sometimes the rules really don't support that kind of fun, and it requires you as the GM to like improvise a little bit and come up with stuff. And like because there's players always want to do things like I want to try and stab them in the jugular or something along that nature. And the problem with that is like you're always technically trying to stab them in the jugular, but hit points in D&D is an abstraction, right? And whether you have one hit point missing or all but one missing, it's the same thing. It really doesn't affect your character. But maybe if you're like, well, how are you going to try and do that? How do you want to stab them in the jugular? And they're like, I want to jump on their back and take my dagger to their throat. Well, maybe you can do something with that. All right, give me an athletics check. Let's do a grapple. If you succeed this grapple, I'll give you advantage to stab them with your dagger or whatever. Reward them for coming up with an idea, even if it's not really in the rules. Encourage your players to do crazy stuff. And that can also apply to old players as well. I mean, in some ways, in my Under the Dome game, even though it's all veteran players, we're using new rules, and especially early on in that campaign, the players really wanted to try and push and see what they can get away with because they all have essentially motorcycles, and they all wanted to try and use their motorcycles as weapons at some point or another.
And it's like, well, you can certainly do that, but you understand that if you're going at max speed of 120 foot or a movement, and you screw up, well, what happens if you fall 120 feet? Well, that's 12 die 6. Do you want to take 12 die 6 damage?
I will still
or do you want?
I will say a lot of the players were still keen to try. So
well, let's say some of. I don't know what to say about most. We understand that
half,
group
at
for the
least
longest
half.
time. For the longest time, that group had one person who had an above 10 intelligence. So.
Yeah.
Sorry, one character. I don't mean to make this sound like I was insulting any of the players. Of the characters at the table.
I don't know. I don't know all their IQs. Maybe. But it does make for some interesting times. What is one thing you wish you would have known as a GM when you first started out?
I mean, so I would say for starters that like not a lot of GMs, if not all GMs out there, suffer anxiety, pressure, and what have you. Um, I wish that the concept of the DM break or let me take 5 to think about this was a more socially accepted thing so that I like, all right, I'm not prepared for this. Let me take a moment and think about it. lots of DMs do that nowadays. Maybe not so much on stream, but at tables, like, all right, I'm gonna go take a smoke break, or I'm gonna go get something to eat, or I'm gonna use the restroom. I need 5 minutes to just figure out where this direction is going. That this was just an acceptable thing, because there's lots of times where I've made snap decisions when my players decide to do something that I had not thought about. And I don't have any specific examples off of my head, but I know conceptually there were many nights I walked away from a game like, oh my God, how the hell did that happen?
For reals. So Nelson, for beginning players, is a one shot or a campaign better for introducing and teaching what is more important, character development or what the character can do in RPGs? Avram Korvax
Uh,
also adds in know what your character can do. So I would have contradictory advice to Avram, but go ahead.
all right, so I would say a one shot or a campaign for new players. Test them out on a one shot. Let them see if this is something that they want to, devote time and energy towards. Um, but you can plan that one shot to then be able to go into a campaign. So whether you're running the first episode of a campaign or a one shot, conceptually give them one session to figure out, is talking in voices and role playing and, moving little plastic men around a battle grid something that they want to do with their time, or, is this not their deal? Um, whereas if you start the campaign and, one or more player be like, yeah, I'm sorry, this isn't for me. Well, then everybody else who is now committed to the campaign, GM included, now has to now go find new players to get into this. Um, so that's my viewpoint on that part, on that piece of the question.
So yeah, I would say a one shot is easy to turn into a campaign. So like you can't go wrong there, right? Especially if you're talking about new players that haven't played before, you're not sure if they're going to like it or not. But for the second part of it, and this is why I say I kind of disagree with Abram a little bit, is what is more important, character development or what characters can do in an RPG? I say character development because that's actually one of the things that isn't really in the rule books so much, right? Like, I mean, there's some systems that probably do a better job, but in D&D, I don't feel like any of the books go into depth into that. Like the rules, they're gonna pick up and learn the rules as they play. Like the more they come back to the table, the more they're gonna start learning the rules. I mean, I know we all have horror stories with that one player just doesn't seem to want to learn. But
But I would rather deal with a player who's engaged with the story, but every time something happens mechanically, they need help, than somebody who knows how to play the game, but it's only about the game aspects and not the story.
well, because here's what happens. Like, here's an example from our own table, right? Like, we had a player that was kind of excited about playing and the story and developing their character, and then, like, at some point in the game, in the campaign, they had an aha moment where the rules started coming together for them, and they're like, "Oh, my character's built completely wrong. Can I respect my character?" And I'm like, "Sure." But because like because there's certain things in the game that just don't matter, depending on how you're playing, because the rules, right? Like you could go in and be like, all right, I don't want to be a weakling, I don't want to have a weak character, but if you have a dex based character, mechanically, it doesn't really matter if you're weak. It doesn't really affect the game part of it, right? It just kind of hampers you if you're trying to build strength and dex at the same time, but you're really a dex based character. I don't want
Right.
players to think about that in the beginning. I just want them to have fun, and they'll figure out the rules as they go. And also, hey Kenneth, how's it going? They'll figure out the rules as it goes, and I personally, as a GM, have no problem with like, oh, you want to change out characters, you want to keep this character but change them up a little bit. Like, I'm good with all of that. Um, but getting them, like Ted said, getting them engaged in the story, and interacting with the other players and their characters at the table, that stuff is what I would prioritize, that and having fun, right? Like the biggest thing is if you want to retain players, then they got to be having fun at the table, or why would they come back?
100%. And I think the way through that fun is an exciting and engaging story. The players interacting with each other, and all of the players interacting with the story elements. And that could be different for each of them, but it takes all of that to make it a great game. So we
Yeah.
are past the halfway point at this point in time. So I will say that our live chat is sponsored by the amazing people over at Easy Roller Dice. So whether it's your first set of dice or your 1 millionth set of dice, Easy Roller Dice for all your dice rolling needs. They have some new sharp edge resin dice in some amazing color schemes. I know I said this on Friday night, but I'll say it again. Cauldron Smoke and Poison Cloud are two of their recent releases that are absolutely amazing. So head over to easyrollerdice.com. You can use the link down in the description below and go check them out. Check out all of these new dice and use that promo code to get 20% off your first order.
So, one aspect we haven't even touched on yet is the idea that, inside the game you can be a beginner, right? Like when you first start off as a first level character and you start your adventuring, you are a beginner. And I feel it. I mean, in 5e, that's a little trickier because the power level of a beginning character is so much different than, say, a first edition or second edition character, where they were so much more frail. Your wizard would roll a d4 for his hit points. Probably didn't have a con bonus, and a commoner with a dagger could probably take you out.
Yeah, a country bumpkin, of a character was absolutely something that that could exist, and it's like literally you have walked away from your family farm, and the adventure starts. Like, all right, so you've had a tiny bit of training in hand to hand combat or what have you, but you don't have the concept that you have nowadays of like, all right, well, you had a background of one thing, and then you've had a formal education, time frame in some other thing. Now go, because conceptually, when you make a character in fifth edition, you have a race, you have a background, and you have a class. All of these things build your character from the ground up. Even though you don't pick them necessarily in that order. um but you have time block where you've just been that thing, so it means your character conceptually, mechanically, seems a lot more mature than what we started off when we first began playing this game.
Yeah, Kenneth. Back in my day, mages had D4 hit points and a single spell slot, and we loved it. Man, back in my day, we wished we had a single spell slot. You had a single spell prepared, right? Like it wasn't like you had spells to choose from with your one spell slot. It was that one spell, and that was it.
Yeah, I remember my first level, fire mage, who his fire spell was Burning Hands, which meant he had to get up and close to use that spell. It's like, all right, I've got 3 hit points, and I'm gonna run up to these guys, and I'm gonna spread my fingers and put out this cone of fire, and then pray that I get to live
Pray
to my next turn.
There's no one left to stab me with a sword. That sword,
So
on average, does more hit points than I have.
And we've joked about Steve's character, the dreaded necromancer
of Doom,
who 7th level had 15 hit points.
Yeah, it was a different time. Well, what do you think it means to be a beginner in 5e? Like, not as a player, but as the character. Like, you already started getting into that a little bit, where like you have a background, so that's something you did before you took on your character class, which is your adventuring profession, I guess, is the best way to put it.
So looking at it from a human perspective, my and you.
I don't know, but somehow you got muted again. I don't know how long you were muted for, but someone just mentioned it, and that's really weird.
That is crazy. Maybe YouTube doesn't like me. Maybe YouTube says you talk too much, Ted. I don't know.
I don't think YouTube has control of OBS.
All right. Well, maybe OBS thinks I talk too much.
I don't know.
Maybe it likes you better because it's on your computer.
Or I just bumped something somehow.
But so I'll reiterate then. So from a background, it's a chunk of time, and you build connections that have a thing mechanically. So whether you're a sage or a scholar, or sorry, not a scholar, an acolyte, um, these people are willing to give you information or give you room and board, depending upon what thing you have, all based on your service to said community. So to me, that represents a chunk enough time that you've made an impact on them, and therefore they're willing to help you out sometime in the future. But then after that, you've done something, and short of like warlock, cleric, or sorcerer, like everything denotes almost like a formal training, maybe an organization. It might be town guard, it might be the local militia, it could be you fought in a war, but you know how to use weapons and armor. How did you come to do that? That is not something you just pick up overnight. You've been trained to become a druid or a wizard. Well, did you have a mentor and train one-on-one? Did you go to some kind of school like the candlelight book? Did you do something that denotes formal training, or did you somehow learn all of this on your own? And it's all like, well, I've got a book that somebody left behind, and I'm figuring this stuff out as I go. Sorcerer, warlock, cleric, these are all ones that like you can just snap a finger and somebody has turned on a switch and you now have power. But beyond those guys, everything else needs time frame in order to be able to do these things. And even some of the others, or some of those three, you might say, all right, well, you've started off gaining power, but then was there training thereafter, or are you bumbling your way through this newly begotten thing?
Yeah, so it is funny, right? Because like when you look at the 5e first level character compared to like the earlier editions, where like the earlier editions were closer to a 5e commoner than than the actual characters that we have to play with now.
Sure.
So I feel like we don't play beginner characters very often anymore. We generally start our campaigns at third or higher level, right? And so pretty much everyone is usually pushing. If the GM says third, then everyone's like, well, can we start at fourth so we can get our get a feat or an ability increase. You know, so like that almost seems like the beginner level in a lot of our adventures now. Maybe we need to like revisit that in the next campaign and think about what it really means to play, you know, a beginner character again, and you know, explore like someone who is really, you know, they had this previous life and now they've just kind of finished up um, their professional training into their character class.
So
Unless you're a warlock or a sorcerer who's just kind of like stumbled into their power.
so with that, what do you feel like the mindset of deciding to become an adventurer? You know, what does that mean to you? You're just beginning out, you know, on this road of mercenary, sellsword, treasure hunter, like in a world like, you know, Forgotten Realms, the concept of an adventurer is a thing, but you know, not everybody plays in the realm. Some people play in other established worlds or their own homebrew settings. So conceptually, like, what does that term mean? You know, to the world and to the individual who decides, you know what, I don't want to live a normal life.
You know what I feel like it's kind of like? I feel like it's kind of like a kid today growing up who goes, you know, hey, little Johnny or Susie, what do you want to be when you grow up? A fireman or a police officer or astronaut? And they're like, nope, I want to be an influencer. And I feel like adventurers in those worlds that kind of consider that they're its own thing, its own profession. I feel like they're that world's version of an influencer, right?
Wow, I think there's going to be a lot of people out there be like, yeah, I don't want to be an adventurer anymore.
Well, think about it, right? Like becoming an influencer, like if you make it, it's really worth it. And, you know, uh, it's you know fame and money for what's perceived to be not a lot of work, but you know that's not often really the case. But you know, venturing's just like that, except for you might die.
I just know that I've
Uh,
spoken to a handful of you know, college age you know, people in you know, recent years, and to some people the term influencer, like, you know, it's got connotations and like, all right, I don't really care about influencers. I think they're this, that, and the other thing. And I'm like, all right, well, there are different types of influencers that are out there. But I just thought it was so amusing that some people were like vehemently against that term and anyone that would consider themselves one. And I'm like, wow,
well, you know, it's just someone has influence. But that
sure.
being said, right, like so what it looks like when you're starting out, right? So you've had this you've got your background, so that kind of says, well, where your characters come from. And then you're gonna have your place of where you've gotten your training from, right? And whether you know, whether it's in the army or you know, you squire to a knight, you know, at a tower of high sorcery like Dragonlance, um, but then like what like you said, what is it that made you leave that and the relatively safety of that in order to go adventuring, right? Now, a lot of times the way we've played our games in the past is most of our adventures always kind of stumbled into it. Like we always played them as kind of like regular people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. I think that kind of shifted with 5e mainly because like at a certain point it's hard to see those even those first level characters as being anything but extraordinary compared to the general populace.
Sure. I have one character that I remember their beginning, that we started in second edition, and it's one of my favorite characters. So I'm certain that, you know, you well know the story, but you know, my character Tull, my undead slayer, like, whether he was extraordinary, I mean, he was, you know, statistically wise, he was, or not. um like he had set out to do something grandiose from first level character. So like I know he did not, just stumble into a scenario, but it was one of those things that I can recollect, you know, where he met the party and what was going on and the exact responses from some of the other players around the table.
So that's the reason, and so like the reason why, because like you said, like most of your characters didn't have that extraordinary beginnings, but that one did. In 5e, they all kind of almost could have that.
Right.
Uh, they all are like almost like, even if you look at it from like a military perspective, right? The characters that are martially trained, their character is basically a commando or special forces in training compared to the rest of the stock and standard issue militias and armies, right? So for them to leave, it would have to be something extraordinary, like with Toll, where he had a quest he was on, right? And like the kingdom that he was from, suffered a undead incursion, and that's why he became an undead slayer. And also, like the queen, his
Queen was
queen
sick.
was sick because of that. Something happened, and he was seeking the cure, um, and also just crushing undead wherever he could find them,
And getting kicked by giants.
and getting kicked by giants. But that's why I liken um, D&D adventures, especially in 5e, to influencers, right? Because I feel like for the most part, like they already are the cream of the crop, and they could probably live a pretty good life if they never go outside the bounds of norm civilization. But they do anyway. They leave to be adventurers, whether they
Right.
do have a specific quest like Toll did, or if it really is to try and strike it rich and become famous. Right. So to me, like that just defines what an influencer kind of is, and that's what they're trying to do. So I
Right.
feel like maybe for beginning adventurers, a more modern take is needed, compared to where, we came from with first edition, second edition, and even third edition. Although someone did bring up the bane of cat, the house cat, uh, in which is funny because in third edition, the way the CR system worked, the house cat was a third of a CR, I think, and a
And a
kobold was a
kobold was the
sixth.
sixth.
And so all you needed was a bunch of cats to get rid of your kobold problems.
Indeed. Every cat could take two kobolds
according to this
mechanically.
according to the CR system, which actually works slightly better than 5e.
Well, that is true.
So with that in mind, with that kind of Parks, boredom is a good motivation to start adventuring. Is it though? Is it really? Like as a player character that doesn't really suffer the consequences of your characters, sure. But if you were to actually live and breathe in that world, I think I think the best example of what it would be like to be an adventurer or like a normal person is to look at Lord of the Rings and the Hobbits, and like how thoroughly miserable they are most of the time when they're going out on their grand adventure. And I feel like that's what it would be for most people. So like you have to be doing it for something, something more than the boredom alone to keep you going, whether it be gold or fame or to cure a sick elven queen.
Or because your master refuses to teach you more spells until you've gone and gotten some practical real world knowledge like he did, like our favorite librarian Giles.
Yeah, and like that's another good example where like a lot of those characters kind of got thrust into it. Like your character sought it out. His character wanted to learn more, but his master refused to teach him more unless he went out and experienced the real world some first. Monks are kind of easy because like I feel like part of being a monk is like going out on your walkabout, and then and then coming back after that.
Sure. If you want to take some guide from Critical Role, Keyleth, the druid, had to do her Aramente. She had to go visit other other tribes in the world. So you could take that kind of thing as a background choice of like, well, my character is going to go explore the world anyway. So perhaps, whether it be a character goal that's set by themselves or set by their mentor, you have to go out and visit these locations. You need to go see these things because that's what it's going to take for you to fully, you know, get your power. Whatever you and your GM want to work out wise. I thought that was a really really cool story for Keela to have to visit all of her people over the course of her journey and do this druid test to say that she could advance in power, which is how druids used to have to do it in their older
I
editions.
feel like that was a bit of a kinder throwback to where what was it once you hit a certain level and drove it was like it was high but it wasn't like that high, it was like ninth level or something.
Thought it was 12th.
But at a certain point you couldn't advance to the next level until you beat the other one guy that had that rank or certain number of people that had that rank. You had to find one of them and take their place by defeating them in combat.
Yeah, it was rough. But I mean, the classes were less balanced back then, so it was like, all right, you got access to some really cool abilities and spells. Is it worth the trade off?
Yeah. So we're getting close to the end here. Um, is there anything we haven't covered that you feel like you'd feel remiss if we did it before we do get out of here?
So as a new player, keep your eyes open, be prepared to be engaged with the material and with the other players and characters at the table. As a new GM, bite the bullet, give it a shot. Um, there are always more people seeking to play than there are enough GMs out there to run for them. And I myself was kind of pushed into running for what we colloquial referred to as the Nerdarchy table, and I never looked back. Like I'm happy to be able to sit behind the screen and share my perspective of the game and my story. Um, get out there and give it a shot.
Agreed. And you know what? Never stop evangelizing the hobby. Keep trying to bring in new players. They're the lifeblood of what we do. Um, for me, I still love seeing new players at the table, seeing them flourish and grow, and you know, when they finally get it, it is like this magical moment at the table. When we were at D&D in the castle, uh, my wife got roped into a one shot, and she's been playing for a couple years now, but she's very much a casual. Is not very vested in learning the rules. For her, it's more about hanging out with the people and being friends, and the gaming is just something we do. Um, but when she got roped into that one shot, it was with other players that were less experienced, and she was actually able to help them, you know, uh, with their characters and at the table. So I feel like the mentoring in the hobby is still super important, and to having that camaraderie around the table, especially in person games, it's a lot easier. Where you can sit there with someone and you can have like a side conversation to help them out when they need it. But when you never be afraid to bring new players into the table, even if it's going to slow things up a little bit, because you never know that new player may someday be one of your GMs that gives you a bit break from running sometimes. So
Indeed.
it is very important to keep bringing in the new players.
100% agree.
So with that, until next time, stay nerdy.
Stay nerdy.